You're about to witness an extraordinary discovery that rewrote American history. This is the true story of a veteran and his loyal German shepherd who stumbled upon a secret that had been rusting away in the Montana wilderness for over 70 years. What they found inside an abandoned train car would expose one of the darkest chapters of our past and bring justice to families who never knew the truth about their loved ones. Before we embark on this incredible journey together, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss another captivating story of hidden history and remarkable discoveries. Now, let's follow the trail that led to one of the most significant historical finds of our time. The morning of October 15th, 2023, began like countless others for Marcus Kane. He woke at 0500 hours, a habit ingrained from 25 years of military service that no amount of civilian life could break. His small cabin in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana was still dark, the October sun not yet cresting the peaks that surrounded his isolated home. Marcus moved through his morning routine with mechanical precision. Coffee, black, made in the same percolator he'd carried through deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. A simple breakfast of eggs and toast, medication for the chronic pain in his left knee, a souvenir from an IED explosion outside Kandahar that had ended his military career and nearly his life. Dakota, his 4-year-old German shepherd, watched him from her bed near the wood stove, her intelligent brown eyes tracking his every movement. She knew the routine as well as he did, knew that soon they would head out into the wilderness that had become their sanctuary. Dakota wasn't just a pet. She was a trained service dog, attuned to the subtle changes in Marcus's behavior that preceded the panic attacks, the flashbacks that could transport him instantly from the Montana mountains back to the dusty streets of Fallujah or the rocky valleys of Afghanistan. Marcus had come to Montana 3 years earlier, after his medical retirement from the army. The transition to civilian life had been brutal. The noise and chaos of city life in Denver, where he'd first tried to settle, had been unbearable. Every backfiring car was potential gunfire, every crowded space a tactical nightmare, every unexpected sound a threat to be assessed and neutralized. The hypervigilance that had kept him alive through 5 combat deployments now made normal life impossible. Sleep came rarely, and when it did, it brought nightmares that left him gasping and soaked in sweat, reaching for a weapon that was no longer there. The therapists at the VA had suggested a service dog, and Marcus had resisted at first. He'd worked with military working dogs in Afghanistan, had seen their capabilities, but accepting help even from an animal felt like admitting weakness. It was his daughter, Sarah, who had finally convinced him. "Dad," she'd said during one of their video calls, "you spent 25 years taking care of other people. Maybe it's time to let someone take care of you, even if that someone has 4 legs and bad breath." Dakota had come from an organization that specialized in training service dogs for combat veterans. From the moment they'd met, there had been a connection, an understanding that transcended words. Dakota could sense Marcus's anxiety before he was even aware of it himself, would position herself between him and perceived threats, would wake him from nightmares with gentle persistence, pulling him back from the edge of panic into the present moment. The move to Montana had been Dakota's idea in a way. During a camping trip to test their compatibility, Marcus had noticed how both he and the dog had relaxed in the wilderness, away from the sensory overload of urban life. He'd found the cabin for sale online, a former Forest Service outpost that had been converted to a residence, accessible only by a dirt road that was impassable for several months each winter. Perfect isolation, perfect peace. That morning, as Marcus finished his coffee and Dakota stretched in that elaborate way dogs do, he studied the weather through the cabin's window. October in the Bitterroots was unpredictable, summer's warmth giving way to winter's grip sometimes in a matter of hours. Today looked clear, though, with that crystalline quality that mountain air gets in autumn, when the humidity drops and you can see for miles. The aspen and larch had turned gold, creating rivers of color through the dark green of the evergreen forest. It was Marcus's favorite time of year, when the tourists had gone home, but the snow hadn't yet locked him in. "Ready for a walk, girl?" Marcus asked, and Dakota's tail immediately began wagging, her entire back end moving with enthusiasm. This was their ritual, their daily communion with the wilderness that had given them both a second chance at life. Marcus packed his day pack with practiced efficiency. Water for both of them, emergency medical kit, GPS beacon, satellite phone for emergencies, bear spray, his Glock 19 in a chest holster, energy bars, dog treats, emergency shelter, fire-starting kit. You could take the soldier out of the army, but you couldn't take the army out of the soldier. He'd learned in Afghanistan that preparation was the difference between a close call and a casualty. They left the cabin as the first rays of sunlight painted the peaks pink and orange, a phenomenon the locals called alpenglow. Marcus had discovered dozens of trails in his 3 years here, some official Forest Service paths, others game trails that had been used by deer and elk for generations. Today, he chose what he'd come to think of as the North Circuit, a challenging 8-mile loop that would take them up to a ridgeline with spectacular views before descending through a series of valleys back to the cabin. For the first 2 miles, they hiked in comfortable silence, the only sounds their breathing and the crunch of frost-brittle grass under their feet. Dakota ranged ahead and to the sides, investigating interesting smells, occasionally flushing a grouse or surprising a squirrel, but always keeping Marcus in sight. She'd been trained to maintain contact, to never wander so far that she couldn't return quickly if needed. It was at mile marker 3, near an old, lightning-struck pine that Marcus used as a waypoint, that everything changed. Dakota suddenly stopped, her body going rigid in a way Marcus recognized immediately. This wasn't her casual interest in wildlife or old scents. This was her working posture, the same intense focus she showed when detecting an oncoming panic attack or when she'd found that lost hiker the previous spring. "What is it, girl?" Marcus asked, moving up beside her. Dakota's nose was working furiously, her tail straight out behind her, every muscle tense with concentration. Then, without warning, she broke from the trail, plunging into the thick underbrush to their left. "Dakota, heel!" Marcus commanded, but the dog ignored him, crashing through the huckleberry bushes and vine maple with single-minded determination. This was highly unusual. Dakota never ignored commands unless she was in active service mode, responding to something more important than obedience. Marcus followed, pushing through the dense vegetation, branches catching at his clothes and pack. The ground began to slope downward steeply, and he realized they were descending into a ravine he'd never explored. The forest here was different, older, untouched by the logging that had scarred much of the region in the early 20th century. Massive Douglas firs and western red cedars towered overhead, their canopy so thick that the forest floor was in perpetual twilight. The air was cooler here, damper, with that primordial quality of places humans rarely venture. Dakota's barking echoed through the ravine, urgent and insistent. Marcus increased his pace, half sliding down the steep slope, using trees to control his descent. His combat instincts kicked in, hand moving unconsciously to check his sidearm, eyes scanning for threats even as he followed his dog's voice. He pushed through a final curtain of vegetation and stopped so abruptly he nearly fell. There, nestled in the ravine like the carcass of some impossible beast, was a train. Not just a few cars, but an entire locomotive, and what looked like at least 8 cars, all being slowly consumed by the forest. Trees grew through broken windows, their roots buckling the floors, their branches reaching out through holes in the roofs. The metal was so corroded in places that it looked like lace, delicate and brittle, ready to crumble at a touch. Marcus's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. There were no railroad tracks here, or at least none visible under decades of forest detritus. The nearest rail line was 20 miles away, on the other side of the mountain. How had an entire train ended up in this ravine? And more importantly, why had it been abandoned here, left to rot in secret rather than salvage for scrap? Dakota was at the third car from the engine, pawing at what had once been a door, now hanging askew on broken hinges. She looked back at Marcus, whining, the sound high and urgent. Whatever she'd detected was in there, and it was important enough that she'd broken training to find it. Marcus approached carefully, his feet testing each step on the uneven ground covered in decades of fallen needles and decomposing leaves. The locomotive was a diesel-electric model. He could tell that much, probably from the 1940s or early 1950s, based on the design. The paint had long ago succumbed to rust and weather, but he could make out patches of olive drab, military green. His pulse quickened. A military train hidden in the Montana wilderness. His mind immediately went to Cold War scenarios. Secret weapons, classified cargo, something the government wanted to disappear. But why here? Why not destroy it properly, or bury it somewhere more secure? The side of the car where Dakota waited bore markings under the rust and moss. Marcus pulled out his knife and carefully scraped at the metal, revealing stenciled letters, U.S. Army, and below that, a series of numbers and what looked like a date, 07-15-1951, July 15th, 1951. The Korean War was in full swing then, Marcus knew. He'd studied military history extensively, both during his service and after, but he'd never heard of any significant military operations in Montana during that period, certainly nothing that would involve losing an entire train. Dakota had managed to squeeze through the gap in the door and was now inside the car, her barking taking on a metallic echo in the confined space. Marcus tested the door, finding it stuck fast, rusted in place. He retrieved a small pry bar from his pack, standard equipment for his wilderness expeditions, and worked at the door until it groaned open wide enough for him to squeeze through. The smell hit him immediately: rust, decay, mold, and something else. Something chemical and sharp that made his nose burn and his eyes water. The interior of the car was chaos. Wooden crates, most collapsed from rot and age, spilled their contents across the floor. Papers, turned to mulch by decades of moisture, formed a carpet of decomposed information. Equipment he couldn't immediately identify in the dim light lay scattered and broken. Dakota was at the far end of the car, standing rigid beside what looked like a filing cabinet, its drawers pulled out and contents scattered as if someone had searched through them in a hurry decades ago. But that wasn't what had captured her attention. She was focused on a metal box, about the size of a footlocker, partially buried under collapsed ceiling panels. Marcus cleared the debris carefully, mindful of the unstable structure around him. The roof had partially caved in, and he could see daylight through several holes. The whole car could collapse at any moment. The box was military issue, he could tell that immediately. Heavy-duty construction with reinforced corners and thick clasps that had somehow resisted the rust that had claimed everything else. Most importantly, it was sealed with wax around the edges, an old method of waterproofing that he'd seen in military museums. He shouldn't open it. Marcus knew that. The smart thing would be to report this find to the authorities, let them handle whatever secrets this train had been carrying. But Marcus had learned in his military career that sometimes the authorities were more interested in keeping secrets buried than in uncovering truth. And Dakota's behavior suggested this was important, perhaps urgently so. The clasps resisted at first, 70 years of inactivity having frozen them in place. Marcus applied steady pressure, and finally, they gave way with a snap that echoed through the car. The lid was heavy, and he had to use both hands to lift it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had miraculously preserved them, were documents, photographs, and what looked like medical vials, their contents long evaporated, but their labels still partially legible. Marcus picked up the top document with trembling hands. It was a memorandum on Department of Defense letterhead dated July 15th, 1951. The classification stamps were still visible. Top secret, eyes only, Project Mindbridge. The subject line made his blood run cold. Operation Paperclip, secondary protocol, disposition of test subjects failed. Operation Paperclip. Marcus knew that name. Every military historian did. It was the post-World War II program that had brought Nazi scientists to America, men who had worked on rockets, jet engines, and other advanced weapons for Hitler's regime. It was controversial but well-documented history. The scientists had been given new identities, clean records, and positions in American research facilities. Werner von Braun, the father of the American space program, had been one of them. But this memorandum suggested something darker, something that had never made it into the history books. He read on, the formal military language barely disguising the horror of what it described. The test subjects referenced were American soldiers, volunteers who had been told they were participating in medical research that would help protect troops from biological and chemical weapons the Soviets were supposedly developing. Instead, according to the documents, they had been subjected to experiments designed by former Nazi scientists, experiments that had gone catastrophically wrong. The memorandum detailed procedures that made Marcus's stomach turn. Injection with experimental compounds, exposure to extreme psychological stress, surgical modifications to brain tissue, all in pursuit of creating what the documents called enhanced soldiers. Troops who could operate without sleep, feel no fear, ignore pain. The experiments had failed catastrophically. The soldiers had suffered hallucinations, paralysis, organ failure, and eventually complete psychological breakdown. Several had become violent, attacking researchers and other test subjects before being subdued. Others had simply shut down, becoming catatonic, unreachable, lost in whatever hell the experiments had created in their minds. The train, according to the documents, had been carrying these soldiers to a facility in the Pacific Northwest, where they were to be processed, a euphemism that became clear as Marcus read further. They were to be eliminated, and their bodies destroyed to hide evidence of what had been done to them. The cover story had already been prepared: a training accident, a truck convoy that had gone off a mountain road, bodies too damaged for open-casket funerals. Marcus's hands shook as he set down the memorandum and picked up a manila folder filled with photographs. They were black and white, grainy but clear enough to show young men in military uniforms smiling at the camera, unaware of what was about to happen to them. On the back of each photo was written a name, rank, serial number, and hometown. Private First Class Anthony Romano, age 19, from Brooklyn, New York. Corporal James Washington, age 22, from Birmingham, Alabama. Sergeant Michael O'Brien, age 24, from Boston, Massachusetts. Specialist David Kowalski, age 20, from Chicago, Illinois. Private Robert Martinez, age 18, from San Antonio, Texas. The list went on. 43 names, 43 young Americans who had trusted their government, who had volunteered for what they thought was important research, who had been betrayed in the most fundamental way possible. Dakota whined, pressing against Marcus's leg. She could sense his distress, the rage building inside him like a pressure cooker. These men had been murdered, not by enemies of America, but by Americans, by people who had sworn the same oath he had sworn to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Marcus forced himself to continue reading, to document everything with his phone's camera. There was no signal this deep in the mountains, but he needed to preserve this evidence. He found correspondence between high-ranking officials, debate about how to handle the situation, memos discussing the cover stories that would be fed to the families. Most damning of all was a list of everyone who knew the truth, from the scientists who had conducted the experiments to the officials who had ordered the cover-up. Some of the names were familiar to Marcus, Men who had gone on to illustrious careers in government and industry, their reputations built on a foundation of hidden corpses and grieving families who never knew the truth. One name in particular stood out: General Harrison Walker, who had later become a senator and chairman of the Armed Services Committee. Walker had been dead for 20 years, but his son was currently a federal judge, his grandson a congressman. The Walker family's political dynasty had been built on blood. Marcus moved to the next car, Dakota leading the way, her nose telling her there was more to find. This car was different. It had been a passenger car, with rows of seats now collapsed and rotting. But there were personal effects scattered among the debris: watches, rings, photographs of girlfriends and wives, letters never sent. These were the belongings of the 43 men who had never made it home. In what had once been an overhead compartment, Marcus found a journal, its pages brittle but still readable. It belonged to Sergeant O'Brien, and his entries documented the experiments in heartbreaking detail. The early entries were optimistic, full of pride at being selected for a special program, excitement about contributing to American military superiority. O'Brien wrote about the other volunteers, the friendships they'd formed, the jokes they shared to deal with the increasingly uncomfortable procedures. As the entries progressed, the tone changed. O'Brien described headaches that felt like his skull was splitting, vision problems that made the world look like a kaleidoscope, voices that weren't there. He wrote about Private Martinez's seizures, about Corporal Washington's screaming nightmares, about Specialist Kowalski clawing at his own eyes, saying he needed to let the light out. The final entry, dated July 14, 1951, the day before the train's departure, was just 4 words, written in a shaky hand that barely resembled O'Brien's previously neat script: "They're going to kill us." Marcus had to stop reading, had to step outside the car and breathe the clean mountain air. Dakota stayed close, her warm presence the only thing keeping him grounded. He'd seen death in war, had lost friends in combat, had held dying soldiers as they called for their mothers. But this was different. This was betrayal of the deepest kind. American soldiers sacrificed not for their country, but for the careers and reputations of men who saw them as expendable lab rats. As he stood there, trying to process what he discovered, Marcus noticed something else. The engine of the train showed signs of sabotage. The control panel had been destroyed with what looked like sledgehammer blows. The boiler had been deliberately damaged, pipes cut, valves smashed. Someone had made sure this train would never move again. The answer to who came in the 5th car, in another sealed box that contained the personal effects and final testament of Captain William Foster, the officer who had been assigned to oversee the transportation of the test subjects. His letter, addressed to "Whoever finds this," told the story Marcus had been piecing together. Foster had discovered the true nature of his mission only after the train had departed. One of the soldiers, delirious from the experiments, had told him everything, had begged for help, had shown him the injection marks, the surgical scars hidden under uniforms. Foster had confronted Dr. Heinrich Müller, the lead scientist on the train, a former Nazi who had worked at Dachau before being brought to America under Operation Paperclip. Müller had been frank about the situation. The experiments had failed. The test subjects were being terminated to prevent embarrassment to the program and to protect the valuable scientists involved. Foster would be well compensated for his cooperation and silence. If he refused, he would be eliminated as well, another casualty of the training accident that was about to occur. Foster had pretended to agree, had waited until they were in the remote wilderness of Montana, and then had acted. He'd overpowered the guards, destroyed the engine, and driven the train off a spur line into this ravine where he knew it would be hidden by the forest. He'd killed Müller and 2 other scientists in the fight, their bodies somewhere in the train. Then he'd sealed the most important documents in waterproof containers, hoping that someday they would be found. "I cannot be party to this evil," Foster had written in his final letter. These men trusted their country, trusted their officers, trusted me. I failed them by not seeing the truth sooner, but I will not fail them in this. Their families deserve to know they were heroes, not victims of an accident. They deserve to know their sons died because evil men in American uniforms decided their lives were worth less than the knowledge in Nazi minds. I know I will not survive this. They will never let me leave this ravine alive, but the evidence will survive. The truth will survive. Someone someday will find this train and will have the courage to do what I could not, bring these crimes to light and give these men the justice they deserve. To whoever reads this, I ask only one thing: remember their names. They were not statistics or test subjects. They were Americans who answered their country's call and were betrayed. Tell their stories, find their families, give them the honor in death that was stolen from them in life. Foster's body, or what remained of it, was in the engine compartment. He had died at his post, ensuring that the train would never reach its destination. A bullet hole in the skull suggested he hadn't waited for his enemies to find him. Marcus stood in silence for a long moment, one soldier honoring another who had chosen conscience over survival, integrity over complicity. Dakota suddenly tensed, her ears perking up, a low growl rumbling in her chest. Marcus immediately went on alert, hand moving to his sidearm. Had someone followed them? The forest was silent except for the normal sounds of wind and birds. Then he heard it. A helicopter in the distance, getting closer. It could be coincidence. Search and rescue operations weren't uncommon in these mountains, but Marcus's instincts, honed by years in combat zones, told him otherwise. Someone knew about this train. Someone was still watching, still protecting the secret even after all these years. He quickly gathered the most important documents, stuffing them into his pack. The photographs of the soldiers, Foster's letter, the most damning memos. He took everything he could carry. Dakota led the way out of the train, moving with the urgency of a dog who sensed danger. They climbed out of the ravine by a different route, Marcus using his GPS to mark the location of the train while avoiding the path they'd taken down. The helicopter was closer now, definitely searching, flying a grid pattern that suggested they were looking for something specific. Marcus and Dakota moved through the forest with practiced stealth, using the thick canopy as cover. They took a circuitous route back to the cabin, doubling back several times, using creek beds to break their trail. It took 4 hours instead of the usual 2, but when they finally reached the cabin, they were alone. If you're as moved by this discovery as we are, please take a moment to like this video and share it with others who need to know this hidden history. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because what Marcus did next would trigger a battle for truth that reached the highest levels of government. Marcus knew he couldn't sit on this information, but he also knew that going through official channels would likely result in the evidence disappearing, and possibly him disappearing as well. He needed allies, people with the power and platform to ensure this story couldn't be buried again. His first call was to Jennifer Hayes, an investigative journalist he'd known in Afghanistan. Jennifer had been embedded with his unit during his 3rd deployment, and she'd proven herself fearless in pursuit of the truth, even when that truth made powerful people uncomfortable. She'd broken the story about contractor fraud that had resulted in congressional hearings and several indictments. "Jennifer, I need you to listen carefully and not ask questions until I'm done," Marcus said when she answered. He told her everything, from Dakota's discovery to the documents he'd found to the helicopter that had appeared so conveniently. There was a long silence when he finished. Then Jennifer said, "Jesus Christ, Marcus, you know what you're saying? You're talking about murder, conspiracy, cover-up at the highest levels of government. I have proof, Jen. Documents, photographs, everything. I'm on the next flight to Montana. Don't talk to anyone else, don't go back to that train, and for God's sake, make copies of everything. Hide them in different places. If what you're saying is true, people have killed to keep this secret. They won't hesitate to do it again." The second call was to Dr. Sarah Martinez, a historian at Georgetown University who specialized in Cold War military programs. Marcus had read her book on MK-Ultra and other experimental programs. If anyone could authenticate these documents and provide historical context, it was her. Dr. Martinez, my name is Marcus Kane. I'm a retired Army Ranger, and I've discovered something related to your research on Cold War experiments. I need your expertise to verify its authenticity. He gave her the broad strokes, and like Jennifer, she was on a plane within hours. The third call was the hardest. Marcus contacted Robert Thompson, a counselor at the VA, who had helped him through his darkest days after retirement. Robert was more than a therapist. He was a Vietnam veteran who understood the weight of secrets, the burden of knowing things that couldn't be unknown. Robert, I need your help reaching out to some families of soldiers who died in 1951, who were told their sons died in a training accident. Marcus, what have you found? The truth about how they really died. And Robert, it's worse than anything we've seen. These families deserve to know. Within 48 hours, Marcus's remote cabin had become command central for what would become one of the biggest stories of the decade. Jennifer arrived with a small crew, just a cameraman and a sound technician, both veterans of conflict zone reporting who knew how to keep secrets until it was time to reveal them. Dr. Martinez brought 2 research assistants and a portable document scanner that could capture high-resolution images without damaging the fragile papers. They worked in shifts, documenting everything. Jennifer conducted on-camera interviews with Marcus, having him walk through his discoveries step by step. Dr. Martinez authenticated the documents, comparing signatures, letterheads, and writing styles with known examples from the period. Every detail was verified, cross-referenced, checked and double-checked, but it was Robert's work that proved most powerful. Using his VA connections and old-fashioned detective work, he managed to locate descendants of 12 of the 43 soldiers. They came from across the country, some driving for days when they heard that there might be answers to questions that had haunted their families for generations. Maria Romano was Anthony's younger sister, now 91 years old, but sharp as a tack. She arrived from New York with her grandson, tears streaming down her weathered face as Marcus showed her the photograph of her brother. "He was so young," she whispered, touching the photo with trembling fingers. "Mama never believed he died in an accident. She said Anthony was too careful, too smart. She went to her grave believing there was more to the story." James Washington, Jr. had been born 2 months after his father's death. He was a 72-year-old retired teacher from Alabama who had spent his entire life wondering about the father he'd never met. "My mother kept all his letters," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "In the last one, he said he was selected for something important, something that would help America. He was so proud." Michael O'Brien's granddaughter, Sarah, was an Army captain herself, currently stationed at Fort Bragg. She had requested emergency leave when Robert contacted her. "I joined the Army because of him," she said, standing at attention despite being in civilian clothes. "My family has served in every American conflict since the Civil War. To know he was murdered by his own, it's a betrayal of everything we stand for." Marcus led them all to the train on a cold November morning. The hike was difficult for some of the older family members, but they were determined. Dakota led the way, somehow understanding the solemnity of the occasion. When they reached the ravine and saw the train, there was a collective gasp, then silence. Marcus watched as Maria Romano entered the car where her brother's belongings had been found. She discovered his St. Christopher medal, the one their mother had given him before he left for basic training. She held it to her chest and wept, 7 decades of grief pouring out in the Montana wilderness. James Washington, Jr. found his father's Bible, warped by moisture but still readable. Inside was a photograph of his mother, young and beautiful, smiling at the camera. A woman James had only known as old and broken by loss. Sarah O'Brien read her grandfather's journal, her military bearing cracking as she reached his final entries. "He knew," she said. "He knew they were going to kill him, and he faced it with courage. That's all any soldier can hope for, to face the end with dignity." Jennifer filmed it all, but with a respectful distance, understanding that this was not just a story, but a reckoning, a moment of truth that these families had been denied for too long. Her report would win awards, but in that moment, she was just a witness to grief and revelation. Dr. Martinez made a discovery that added another layer to the horror. In one of the sealed containers, she found medical records that showed the experiments hadn't just failed, they had been designed to fail. Dr. Muller and his team had known from animal testing that the compounds they were using would cause neurological damage, but they had proceeded anyway, using the American soldiers as test subjects to gather data on human brain deterioration. They were never trying to create super soldiers, Dr. Martinez explained to the assembled families. They were studying how the human brain breaks down under specific chemical stresses. It was Nazi concentration camp science, dressed up as American military research. The story broke on November 15, 2023, simultaneously in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and on 60 Minutes. Jennifer's report led every newscast in the country. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, authenticated by multiple experts. The public reaction was immediate and furious. The Department of Defense initially tried to claim the documents were forgeries, but there was too much corroborating evidence. Records that had been thought destroyed were found in archives, matching the information in the train. Elderly veterans came forward with their own stories of being approached for similar programs, of friends who had volunteered and never returned. Marcus found himself at the center of a media storm he had never wanted. He testified before Congress, Dakota at his side, her presence a reminder that sometimes the most important discoveries come from following instincts rather than orders. He spoke simply and directly, letting the evidence speak for itself. "These men were betrayed," he told the Senate Armed Services Committee. "They volunteered to serve their country and were murdered to protect the reputations of war criminals who should have been tried at Nuremberg, not given jobs in American laboratories. Their families were lied to for 70 years. The least we can do is acknowledge the truth." The legal battles began immediately. The families of the 43 soldiers filed lawsuits against the government, seeking not just compensation, but full disclosure of all records related to the experiments. The Walker family, descendants of General Harrison Walker, who had authorized the cover-up, saw their political dynasty crumble as the full extent of their patriarch's crimes came to light. But there was resistance. Marcus received death threats, anonymous calls warning him to stop pushing to let the dead stay buried. His cabin was broken into while he and Dakota were on a supply run, though the intruders found nothing. Marcus had learned in Afghanistan to never keep all your assets in one location. The documents were stored in multiple safe locations, with copies held by journalists, historians, and lawyers. One night, a black SUV followed him down the mountain road from town. Marcus's combat instincts kicked in, and he managed to lose them on a logging road he knew well. But the message was clear. Powerful people wanted this story to go away. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. An elderly woman in Virginia contacted Jennifer Hayes, saying she had information about the train. Her name was Eleanor Schultz, and her late husband had been one of the guards on the train, one of the men Captain Foster had overpowered. "He never talked about it," Eleanor said, sitting in her living room, surrounded by photographs of a life built on a terrible secret. "But when he was dying, the morphine loosened his tongue. He told me everything. He said Foster was a hero, that he'd saved those boys from something worse than death. He said the scientists had planned to vivisect them, to study their brains while they were still alive." She had kept her husband's footlocker, unopened for 20 years since his death. Inside were his orders, signed by General Walker, authorizing the use of lethal force to maintain the security of Operation Mindbridge. There were also photographs he'd taken secretly, showing the soldiers in various stages of the experiments, evidence that corroborated everything in Foster's letter. The most damning piece of evidence was a recording made on an old wire recorder. Eleanor's husband had secretly recorded a conversation between Dr. Muller and General Walker discussing the disposal of the test subjects and the cover story that would be provided to the families. Walker's voice was clear, callous, treating the soldiers' lives as an acceptable loss for the advancement of American military science. With this new evidence, the government's position became untenable. The president, facing a crisis of confidence in military leadership, ordered a full investigation and declassification of all records related to Operation Mindbridge and similar programs. What emerged was a pattern of human experimentation that went far beyond the 43 soldiers on the train. Marcus and Dakota became regular visitors to Arlington National Cemetery, where a memorial was erected to the 43 soldiers and Captain Foster. It was a simple black granite wall, similar to the Vietnam Memorial, with their names engraved in chronological order of their deaths. At the dedication ceremony, Marcus spoke briefly. These men answered their country's call and were betrayed by those sworn to protect them. Captain William Foster stood against that betrayal, choosing conscience over career, integrity over survival. We honor them not just as victims, but as heroes, men who deserve to be remembered for their service and sacrifice. The memorial became a pilgrimage site for families of other soldiers who had died in suspicious circumstances during the Cold War. Marcus found himself an unwitting spokesman for a movement demanding full transparency about military experimentation on American soldiers. Dr. Martinez's continued research revealed that the train had been one of 3 planned transports. The other 2 had apparently reached their destinations, their human cargo disposed of as planned. Using the documents from the train and Eleanor Schultz's evidence, she was able to identify another 67 soldiers who had been murdered to keep the program secret. Each identification brought a mixture of relief and grief to families who had lived with uncertainty for decades. James Patterson of Ohio learned that his father hadn't deserted the family as they'd been told, but had been selected for experimentation and eliminated when the program was shut down. Mary Chen of California discovered that her brother's training accident had actually been murder, ordered by men who saw him as expendable. The legal ramifications continued for years. Several major pharmaceutical companies were implicated, having knowingly employed Nazi scientists who had conducted human experiments. Universities that had housed research programs linked to Operation Mindbridge faced lawsuits and public condemnation. The Walker family lost everything, their fortune consumed by legal fees and settlements. But perhaps the most significant outcome was the passage of the Foster Act, named after Captain William Foster. The law required full disclosure of any military experimentation involving human subjects, established strict oversight protocols, and created a permanent commission to investigate claims of unethical military research. Marcus was invited to the White House for the signing of the Foster Act. He stood beside the president, Dakota at his side, as the bill was signed into law. It was a moment of triumph, but Marcus felt only exhaustion. The fight for truth had taken everything he had. "Mr. Kane," the president said, shaking his hand, "you've done a great service to your country, to the families of those men, and to the principle that democracy requires transparency, even when that transparency is painful." Marcus nodded, uncomfortable with the praise. "I just followed my dog, Mr. President. She found them. I just made sure they weren't forgotten again." As the years passed, Marcus and Dakota continued their quiet life in the Montana mountains. Dakota was getting older, moving slower on their daily hikes, but she still had that alertness, that instinct for finding what was hidden. They discovered no more ghost trains, no more dark secrets, but Marcus knew their work had mattered. The cabin became something of a shrine for veterans and families seeking closure. Marcus welcomed them all, sharing coffee and stories, helping them understand that their loved ones' sacrifices, even when betrayed, still had meaning. Dakota would lie at their feet, offering the quiet comfort that only a dog can provide. One autumn day, 5 years after the discovery, Marcus and Dakota were visited by an unexpected guest. A young man, maybe 25, wearing army dress uniform with ranger tabs and a silver star. He introduced himself as Lieutenant Anthony Romano III, great-nephew of the Anthony Romano who had died on the train. "I wanted to thank you, sir," the lieutenant said, standing at attention. "Because of you, my family knows the truth. Because of you, my great-uncle is recognized as the hero he was. I joined the army because of him, because of what you revealed about his courage." Marcus looked at the young soldier, seeing in him the same idealism, the same commitment to service that had probably motivated his great-uncle. "Just remember, Lieutenant, your oath is to the Constitution and to your fellow soldiers, not to the people who happen to be in charge. If you're ever asked to do something that betrays that oath, remember Captain Foster, remember your great-uncle. Sometimes the greatest act of service is saying no." The lieutenant nodded solemnly. "Yes, sir. That's why I'm here, actually. I've been assigned to a new unit, one created because of the Foster Act. We investigate claims of unethical treatment of soldiers, past and present. We're calling ourselves the Foster Group. Unofficial motto, truth before comfort." Marcus felt something ease in his chest, a weight he'd been carrying since finding the train. The work would continue. Other soldiers would stand watch against the darkness that could infect even the most noble institutions. The 43 wouldn't be forgotten. Dakota passed away the following spring, her body finally succumbing to age and the accumulated stress of years of service. Marcus buried her on the hillside overlooking the ravine where she'd made her discovery, marking her grave with a simple stone that read, "Dakota, she found the truth." The funeral was attended by dozens of people whose lives had been touched by the discovery. Maria Romano, now 96, made the trip from New York one last time. James Washington Jr. brought his grandchildren, telling them the story of the brave dog who had found their great-grandfather. Sarah O'Brien, now a full colonel, presented Marcus with a flag that had flown over Arlington Cemetery above the memorial to the 43. Marcus adopted another German shepherd, a young rescue he named Foster. Together, they continued the daily hikes through the Montana wilderness, always alert for signs of secrets waiting to be discovered. The ghost train had been preserved as a historical site, with a visitors' center that told the story of the 43 soldiers, Captain Foster's sacrifice, and the discovery that had changed history. School groups came regularly, learning not just about the specific events, but about the broader lessons: the danger of unchecked power, the importance of transparency, the courage required to stand against institutional wrongdoing. Marcus often spoke to these groups, always emphasizing that he had simply been lucky, that Dakota had done the real work. But the teachers knew better. They saw in Marcus what he couldn't see in himself, a man who had chosen truth over comfort, who had risked everything to ensure that 43 forgotten soldiers received justice. They used his story to teach their students about integrity, about the responsibility that comes with discovery, about the importance of bearing witness. The impact of the discovery continued to ripple outward. Other countries began investigating their own Cold War experiments, inspired by the transparency America had shown in confronting its dark past. Germany revealed experiments conducted by scientists who had escaped prosecution after the war. Britain admitted to testing chemical weapons on its own soldiers. The Soviet archives, when finally opened, revealed horrors that dwarfed even Operation Mindbridge. But it was in America that the change was most profound. The Foster Act had created a culture of accountability within the military that hadn't existed before. Whistleblowers were protected, investigations were thorough, and the principle that American soldiers were citizens, not subjects, was enshrined in law and practice. Marcus received letters from around the world, from soldiers and families who had found courage in the story of the ghost train. A British veteran wrote that Marcus's discovery had inspired him to reveal chemical weapons testing he'd been subjected to in the 1960s. An Australian family learned the truth about their father's death in a military accident because their government, shamed by America's transparency, had opened its own files. One letter stood out among the thousands. It was from a young woman in Germany, the great-granddaughter of Dr. Heinrich Müller, the Nazi scientist who had led the experiments on the train. She wrote in perfect English, "Mr. Kane, I have struggled my entire life with the knowledge of what my great-grandfather did, first in the camps, then in America, under a false name. Your discovery has brought me a strange kind of peace, not because it absolves him, nothing could do that, but because it shows that evil can be exposed, that truth can triumph even after decades of lies. My family has donated our entire inheritance to a fund for the families of the 43 soldiers. It cannot undo the harm, but perhaps it can begin to balance the scales." Marcus kept that letter on his desk, a reminder that redemption was possible, that the sins of the fathers didn't have to define the children, that truth, however painful, was always better than comfortable lies. As he approached his 70th birthday, Marcus reflected on the strange path his life had taken. He had gone to war seeking purpose and found trauma. He had retreated to the wilderness seeking peace and found a terrible secret. He had revealed that secret seeking justice and found a new mission. Life, he had learned, rarely gave you what you expected, but sometimes it gave you what you needed. Foster, the new dog, had proven to have the same instincts as Dakota. On their walks, he would sometimes alert to something hidden, some small mystery in the forest. Usually it was nothing significant. Old logging equipment, abandoned camps, the remains of long-ago settlements. But Marcus always investigated, always documented what they found. Because Dakota had taught him that the most important discoveries often looked like nothing at first glance. The ghost train had become more than just a historical site. It had become a symbol of American reckoning with its past, a physical reminder that democracy required constant vigilance against those who would abuse power in its name. Proposals to move it to a museum were consistently rejected. It needed to stay where it was, hidden in the ravine, a testament to how easily truth could be buried and how accidentally it could be discovered. Marcus often stood at Dakota's grave, looking out over the valley where the train rested. He would tell her about the families who had found closure, about the laws that had been passed, about the young soldiers who now stood guard against the kind of betrayal that had killed the 43. He liked to think she understood, that wherever dogs went when they died, she knew her discovery had mattered. The final validation came from an unexpected source. The CIA, under pressure from the Foster Act, released documents related to Operation Mindbridge that they had claimed were destroyed. Among them was a memo from Alan Dulles himself, the CIA director at the time, acknowledging that the experiments were morally indefensible, but arguing they were necessary to match Soviet capabilities. The memo revealed that the Soviets had indeed been conducting similar experiments using captured German scientists, just as America had. The Cold War had been a race to the bottom of human depravity, with both sides justifying atrocities in the name of national security. The difference now was that America had chosen to confront this past, to acknowledge its failures, to ensure they weren't repeated. Marcus was asked to speak at West Point's graduation ceremony, to address the next generation of Army officers about integrity, about the courage to stand against wrongdoing, even when it came from within. He stood at the podium, Foster lying quietly at his feet, looking out at hundreds of young faces full of idealism and determination. "You will face moments in your career," he told them, when you must choose between what is legal and what is right, between following orders and following conscience. In those moments, remember Captain William Foster. Remember the 43. Remember that your oath is not to your superiors, but to the Constitution and to the soldiers you lead. Have the courage to say no when no is the right answer. Have the integrity to expose wrongdoing, even when it costs you everything. Because in the end, you will be judged not by your rank or your medals, but by whether you upheld the values you swore to defend. The applause was thunderous, but Marcus barely heard it. He was thinking about a morning in October, about a dog who had veered off the trail, about following instinct into the unknown and finding truth in the darkness. As he and Foster walked off the stage, Marcus noticed something that would have made him smile if he'd been the smiling type. Several of the new lieutenants were wearing small pins on their uniforms, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. They were replica St. Christopher medals, like the one Anthony Romano had carried. They had become an unofficial symbol among young officers, a reminder of the 43, a commitment to never let such betrayal happen again. The story could have ended there, with justice served and truth revealed. But life, Marcus had learned, didn't offer neat endings. 3 months after the West Point speech, he received a call from the Foster Group the unit Lieutenant Romano commanded. They had found something. "Sir," Romano said, his voice tight with controlled emotion, "we've discovered evidence of another train. In Alaska. The locals have legends about it, about soldiers who went into the mountains and never came out. We think it might be one of the other transports Dr. Martinez identified." Marcus looked at Foster, who was already alert, sensing the change in his handler's energy. The dog was young, eager, trained to find what was hidden, just like Dakota had been. "Send me the coordinates," Marcus said. "We'll take a look." Because that was the thing about truth. It wasn't a destination, but a journey. Each revelation led to another question. Each answer demanded further investigation. The 43 soldiers from the Montana train had received justice, but there were others out there, waiting in the darkness, hoping someone would find them, would tell their stories, would give their families the truth they deserved. Marcus packed his gear, the same methodical process he'd followed thousands of times. Foster watched with barely contained excitement, knowing they were going on an adventure. As they loaded into the truck, Marcus thought about Dakota, about that morning when she'd led him off the trail into the ravine. He thought about choices, about moments that changed everything, about the responsibility that came with discovery. The road to Alaska was long, but Marcus didn't mind. He had a purpose again, a mission that mattered. Somewhere in the Alaskan wilderness, another train waited with its cargo of secrets. Other families deserved answers. Other soldiers deserved justice. As he drove north, Foster alert beside him, Marcus made the same promise he'd made standing at the memorial in Arlington. They would not be forgotten. However long it took, however difficult the search, the truth would be found and told. Because that's what soldiers did for each other, even across the decades, even after death. They stood watch. They bore witness. They ensured that sacrifice, even betrayed sacrifice, was remembered. The Montana ghost train had been the beginning, not the end. Marcus Kane and his dogs, first Dakota, now Foster, would continue following trails others couldn't see, finding what others had hidden, ensuring that America's darkest secrets couldn't stay buried forever. It was hard work, dangerous work, but it was necessary work. Because in the end, democracy depended not on the perfection of its institutions, but on the willingness of its citizens to confront imperfection, to demand accountability, to choose difficult truths over comfortable lies. The 43 soldiers had died, believing in an America that had betrayed them. Marcus's mission was to help build the America they had deserved, one discovery at a time, one truth at a time, one act of justice at a time. The sun was setting as they crossed into Canada, heading for Alaska, heading for another secret waiting to be revealed. Foster was asleep in the passenger seat, conserving energy for the work ahead. Marcus drove on through the gathering darkness, guided by GPS and instinct, following a path that had begun with a dog's nose and a veteran's conscience, and that would continue as long as there were truths to uncover and wrongs to right. This incredible true story reminds us that the most significant discoveries often come from following unexpected paths, that truth has a way of surfacing no matter how deep it's buried, and that one person's courage can change history. If this remarkable journey moved you, please share it with others who need to know about these hidden heroes and the veteran and dog who brought their story to light. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell to join us for more incredible true stories of discovery and justice. Remember, sometimes the most important truths are waiting in the most unexpected places, requiring only someone with the courage to look and the determination to ensure they're never hidden again. Thank you for joining us on this journey into one of America's most significant historical discoveries, proof that justice, though delayed, can never be permanently denied.